This is the ERP Advisor.
Today's episode, Best ERP Strategies for Natural Resource Companies.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar, Best ERP Strategies for Natural Resource Companies. Shawn Windle is our speaker for today. Shawn is the founder and managing principal of ERP Advisors Group based in Denver, Colorado. Shawn has over 20 years of experience in the enterprise software industry, helping hundreds of clients across many industries with selecting and implementing a wide variety of enterprise solutions. His podcast, The ERP Advisor, has dozens of episodes with thousands of downloads and is featured on prominent podcast platforms such as Apple and Spotify. On today's call, Shawn will discuss how companies can leverage software solutions to satisfy requirements throughout the life cycle of their oil and gas, mining, solar, and other natural resource companies. Welcome, Shawn.
Good, thank you.
Thanks
Hi,
for
Julia.
joining me today.
You bet,
Yeah.
you bet.
So ERP software for natural resource companies has evolved quite a bit over the years, considering the increase in environmental regulations and reporting requirements. From what was once not necessarily needed, so to speak, is now an ERP system now is essential for a business to run, whether it be oil, gas, solar, you name it. So with that, Shawn, let me ask you, what is the natural resource industry and what are the implications to ERP?
Sure. So we talk about natural resources. You can think about it as, well, the resources that naturally are available. So we have all the way from the sun to certainly the planet itself. And, we tend to talk about 3 or 4 different industries specifically around natural resources. And each one has a plethora of implications to ERP. There's a million things we can talk about, right? But you can think about mining. We can think about oil and gas. There's certainly solar. There's even biofuels, and there's other areas as well that are all around, again, how do you take the things from the earth or from the sky? Maybe there's even asteroid mining organizations out there. I know I've seen some movies on that. I don't know how real that is.
Right.
It's probably, gosh knows, right? But if you think about the environment and sort of the resources that are within the environment, how do we reform or go through processes, manufacturing processes to take those resources and convert them into something that is usable in a different format. So certainly a lot of energy uses for sure, but many other things that I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yes. So how do ERP requirements for natural resource companies differ from the requirements for other industries?
That's a great question. So if you think about I feel like I'm kind of boring here, so I have to try to make this a little more interesting for our listeners. But if you think about, let's just take a mining company, which is fascinating. What a mining organization is, really, it's pretty incredible, right? If you think about the whole operation, it starts off. There's a life cycle to it that I'm sure we'll talk about for sure. So you got to figure out land rights and exploration, decide where to do whatever the production is. You have to build a big plant to actually do all the work, and then you have to do the work. And then you have the ore, the refined material that then goes through multiple phases and chemical treatments and everything to get to a final product. But that final product for like a mine then would go to others for more refinement. And there's much more technical phrases for that whole process.
Right.
But from an ERP perspective, what's pretty cool about it is you can think about it as generally, and I'm sure the purists on the call might have a different view, but that's okay. But generally, you can think about it like usually from a production standpoint, ERP kind of tracks the process of taking a lot of little things and making a big thing.
Right.
Oil and gas and mining and even solar is taking something that's usually pretty big and breaking it up into little things.
That
So
makes
it's
perfect sense,
So it's
actually.
a little opposite. Yeah. So then how do we capture that from an ERP perspective? Of course, things like purchasing, procure to pay, accounting. The basics are the same, but when we talk about the actual value-added process, it's switched. It's a good way to think about it.
Right. So with the significant differences from the exploration to the production phase, it would seem the natural resource companies must adopt a best of breed approach. And I know we've talked about this in the past, to keep costs manageable with many other issues. Is it true that there are other options on the market to consider for this, for the different phases?
Yeah, for sure. And it's a bit of a misnomer, I think, that we've come across over the years, that, if you're in oil and gas, here's the app you have to go with, right? That's not necessarily true. It sort of depends on where you're at with your process. Like you said, if really, honestly, the interesting thing about natural resources, and it's actually very similar to even like pharmaceuticals, where from a business process perspective, from an ERP perspective, we're spending a lot of money up front, a ton of money, right? So there's capital calls and there's capital structures and debt and equity and all that stuff that's beyond ERP. That's what the people who really know what they're doing get paid for. People like me and the ERP guys, we're just like, hey, what do we build here? Code or right, that kind of stuff. But it's kind of true that really the natural life cycle of these organizations that are in this industry are a ton of money spent up front in exploration. And like in the oil and gas industry, there's organizations, the exploration and production companies, that's where they focus. And that's their business model, and they're capitalized appropriately. Their risk equation covers that. Because, they may do a lot of exploration and not find anything, right? But then they do find something, and now,
then what to do with it.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I always think, this is how old I am, but I came across an old episode of the Beverly Hillbillies.
Oh, funny.
Yes, the other day. And it was so funny to see. It was the first episode, actually, where, Jed Clampett shoots in the ground and up comes a bubbling brood or something?
Yes,
right. That is, right?
Yep.
It's a little more complex than that, of course. But it is that same concept where, people are looking throughout the world for where these reserves of unrefined materials are. And so they really just need to track their costs at that point. It's just like a gigantic checkbook.
Right.
So QuickBooks is fine for that. Honestly, a lot of organizations start with QuickBooks. But the more savvy, experienced operators or CFOs will say, well, I don't really want to start on a system that I know I'm going to outgrow. Right. So maybe they move towards a system that we would call a tier 2 ERP that is not the big guys, right? But it has accounting, it has purchasing, maybe it has some inventory, some warehouse management, the ability to maybe track some assets, right? Or even capital projects, because that's another thing. You can see where this goes, where you're starting to spend all this money and it's like, well, a shovel, gloves, consumables, they're done. They're not going to use that.
Right.
But, after we do the exploration, we decide to start building on a property. We're construction companies, right? Little is known outside of these industries that a huge part of their business process is construction.
That's right.
Because they have to build, 100,000, 300,000 square foot refining facilities.
That's right.
Oil and gas is different, of course. There's the rig and there's everything that goes into that process, which is extremely scientific. I mean, I think that's one of the coolest things about natural resources that I love is that there's this science view. It's like a gigantic science class, right?
That's right.
Where they're taking materials that are, worth something, but being able to convert through assets that either are installed in the ground or processes or even these chemical refinements, and then you have something that's of more value. Like, it's super cool. Again, I don't get to do that fun stuff, right? We get to figure out the purchase to pay, procure to pay process, but you can see we're spending money, we're capitalizing, we have equipment that we need to do depreciation on. We'll probably track some equipment to a specific project, so at least we know where the heck all this money's going, because we have to go back to investors. Because there's usually some pretty big money that goes into a big project.
Right.
And, sometimes you get a blank check, like never. So the reporting has to be really good about, hey, here's the progress that we have percent complete and that kind of thing on, again, sort of thinking of building up these buildings and these facilities. And then, of course, once we start producing, then there's the sort of the order to cash side, which is very different, right? We had an international mine recently that we worked with, and I think they maybe had 12 sales in a year. Right?
Oh, wow.
Tiny. Unlike one of our clients that works with capping equipment with Costco that has, 12 sales in like a minute.
Right,
Like it's
right.
crazy the difference in terms of volume on the order side. And in those instances, the revenue cycle it's more complex for sure when you're selling tons and tons of ore or different kinds of refined products. So there's all kinds of sort of industry specific requirements around that, which it's really hard for a kind of a horizontal, meaning a non-specific to natural resources ERP to handle. But that's where you start to see very vertical focused ERPs. For instance, in oil and gas for what's called joint interest billing on a specific well, there might be multiple owners and we have to bill things differently. And it gets very complex and there's solutions written around that to handle that kind of stuff. So, as we sort of drill into our conversation here, get the analogy.
Right.
It is something to keep in mind that there's a lot of industry specific functionality. I mean, even in oil and gas, there's what's called upstream, right? Which is exploration, production, going into the ground, being able to, extract the oil, right? Then getting it out to what's called midstream, which is the transportation of the product from the oil well and other places through the refinement and all that to then go to downstream, which would be like convenience stores or even transportation to get gasoline.
That's right.
To stores. And there's a ton more. And frankly, the funny thing about us, right, is that, we're not like industry experts. I'm thinking of a guy right now who you and I know who super knows oil and gas. I'm thinking of a lady who really understands the accounting treatment on mining.
That's right.
There's people that have spent 30 years of their career in just these segments. It could be just in upstream, just in one teeny tiny area. It's very complex stuff. But from an ERP perspective, those are the kinds of things we look for. Like we always talk about, like you got to know your needs,
That's
right? But especially in natural resources, even solar. Like we're working with a solar company right now, and what they do is they service solar panels. There's a specific part in the solar panel that has to be serviced and checked, and it's very expensive to do it, and our client does that.
Do they manufacture the solar panels themselves? Just that one part?
Just the one part. And they don't even manufacture it. Somebody else manufactures it. All they do is service.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So I think what's, above, what differentiates this call over many, many others that we've had, and you should start saying, Shawn and Juliet have a podcast on Spotify because it's us. You've been there since the beginning.
It's definitely
Hello,
a team
is this thing
effort.
on?
That's right.
Right, back in the day when we were trying to figure things out.
Exactly.
But really, what makes this call different in this specific area of natural resources, man, this stuff is specialized.
Yes.
Super specialized. So just please, of all the calls, we always say this, blah, blah, blah. But please don't just go out and buy an ERP because you need SAP because you're an oil and gas company. Like you'll die. Like you could literally don't do that. Like you're early in your exploration. You don't need a ginormous application. Even later on, maybe you do. Maybe you have scalability. Well, we've used it 10 times before. I don't get fired for using these Mincon in mining. It's called Ventix. I think it's owned by Hitachi now, right? Or SAP, or what's it called? There's a joint interest billing application for E&P companies called Wolfpack that's been around for a long time. These solutions are good and they're strong,
right?
But just really understand what you need and go out to these vendors and say, can you really do this? Maybe talk to some of the more prevalent vendors too, and they won't know what you're saying. And here's the other thing. Oil and gas people, and even mining people, and even some of the other people in natural resources, the nomenclature is extremely specific.
Okay.
And like healthcare folks and financial services folks, they will use that nomenclature to qualify if people really know what they're talking about. Like if you don't know certain things, I don't even want to talk to you.
Okay.
That
makes
it.
perfect sense, actually.
It does. And I agree with that. But what I would recommend is, hey, you understand your requirements and then go to these vendors and, they might not speak your nomenclature, your taxonomy, definitions and words exactly. But if you look at those requirements and you really just need a procure to pay system and they don't speak oil and gas or they don't speak mining, whatever. Don't worry about it.
That's right. Well, it's like anything, like you said, needs analysis, right? Like once you know what your needs are, then you can go to the vendor and ask for specifics. So regarding natural resource companies, okay, their main business is simple in some sorts, but then very sophisticated in others, right? So instead of biting off more than they can chew with a gigantic ERP system, are there adequate systems that you can customize and have add-ons to?
Yeah.
Like for natural resource, do they do that? Can you customize an ERP to fit your needs?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, if you look at the life cycle, so take let me think of a really good example here. I keep coming back to mining and oil and gas. I think that's where most of the purchase decisions around ERP are made, but even solar, biofuels. Let's take biofuels. That's a great example.
Okay.
That's a great example. So in the biofuels industry, if you think about this, hey, we're going to go out and, we're going to make rocket fuel from corn, or we're going to make whatever from cow patties, right?
Okay,
we're going to take
right.
methane out or whatever.
Right.
Whatever those kind of, the fuel comes from the earth, from other products other than just oil, let's say. Let's just take corn. That's probably the easiest. So now we need to buy a lot of corn. And we need to buy
you
a
have
plant.
to grow. Someone has to grow
Somebody
the
has to
corn
grow
and produce it, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, it literally is, again, break it down to its basics and figure out where you're at. We had a client recently in biofuels, and they would basically purchase the corn. So they had software to track the weight of the rail cars that were coming in.
Wow.
They needed to know how much corn they got, and it would come in on a rail car. So
Instead of taking the word for what is
Yeah.
on the car, they have to weigh it to verify it, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
A very common process, as you can imagine.
Right.
But does the ERP support that? Of course not.
No.
Right? It doesn't. But then they could enter the information into the system or do an integration in. So now we get the corn, we put it in inventory. And there's all kinds of specific rules around corn inventory, right? Some of it spoils, there's shrinkage. There's other things that you have to deal with when you're dealing with a bio-based inventory, right? Like our horticulturalists, the folks that grow plants like perennials and annuals, like their inventory gets bigger and bigger over time. The corn kind of goes down and down even before it's used because it just evaporates. It loses moisture. So we have to have inventory systems that manage that kind of product, which they're not necessarily available in newer next generation solutions. They're available in maybe, how do I say it politically correct, legacy-based technology solutions. But, if we really understand our requirements, can we find that in newer software? And the answer usually is yes, right? Or maybe we build something custom to support it, but it's in a technology platform that's more modern. So good. Now we have the corn inventory. Then we take the corn and we add a whole bunch of chemicals, or maybe even 3 or 4, and a whole bunch of processing. We heat it up, we cool it down, we condense it, we mix in a little bit of this, we mix in a little bit of that, and at the end of the day, we have jet fuel. So there's an inventory process that looks like chemical manufacturing, which a lot of ERPs, well, it's a prevalent requirement. We have many clients that have those needs. But process manufacturing, chemicals manufacturing, again, that might be all you do as a natural resource company. You might not just be in biofuels, you might be the processor. So you just take the corn, do your process, and then whatever the products are, there's usually 4 or 5. There's a product and then byproducts that you can sell too. So you want to track all those inventory items as well.
Right.
And then, I'm probably making it more complex, but there are some requirements oftentimes where the machines that do all this processing are constantly kicking out SCADA data about the process, what the temperature was at this 1/10 of a second, then the next 1/10 of a second, or how fast things are going through or flow through, whatever. So you have that kind of data coming out too. ERPs natively don't really handle that. There is one I can think of that does, called DCOM, that's owned by ECI, but its platform, again, technology-wise, it's not the strongest of platform. Just they need to modernize it. DCOM, if you hear this, modernize, please. And I'm sure they're working on it. I think ECI is putting some money into it, which is great. But there you go. So now you have another requirement around the manufacturing or refinement process of biofuels. We need to track this. Let's put it all in one place. That was a lot.
That was a lot. But you know what? Let me ask you this. This brought to mind, a lot of these companies are independent and privately owned, but they deal with government agencies because they're either on land or they have different regulations. How does an ERP impact those government regulations that these companies have to deal with.
Yeah, and we may get a bunch of calls after I say
Oh,
this.
no.
Very,
Sorry.
very little.
Really?
Yeah, they just don't handle that part of it. Now, some of them do, for sure. And
So let me interrupt you, but
Yeah.
is that handled like separately and manually?
well,
or on a
separately, or manually, depending on how big the operation is.
Okay.
So there's environmental health and safety solutions that all they do is handle things like OSHA reports or
Right.
EPA kinds of reports for the environment on what the effects of the manufacturing process are, if there's carbon or whatever is coming
Right.
out, whatever it is, right?
Right.
There's other systems that do that kind of tracking, but the reality is that it's the people that are doing the measurements, on an hourly basis or whatever the EPA would require for some exhaust.
Mhm.
There may be a machine that's taking those measurements too, but then usually somebody's manually entering that into these other systems. But these other systems are set up to say, hey, here's the 10 reports we need, here's the format, give me the data, I'll get you the format. I'll even send it over to the EPA, or we'll print it out in the format that they need. So you could build some of that again into the ERP platform.
Where it speaks to each other,
where it
right?
speaks to
And
each
it
other.
communicates.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's integrations between these tools as well. So to go a little bit farther with what you're saying, in the natural resources industry, and think through this, we've talked about this before a lot, where there's basically all-in-one solutions. Like, hey, we'll go buy SAP and it does everything, right? It doesn't really, but you can think that. Or we go buy a bunch of little solutions and we wire them together, best of breed. Or there's something in between we call the hybrid, which we like.
Mm-hmm.
And in the natural resources, in these industries that we've talked about, a lot of times they have multiple solutions to handle all this stuff because it is so specialized in certain areas for sure.
Right. Well, you mentioned biofuels, but solar, wind, including biofuels, the
Yeah.
industries, they utilize different processes to begin producing, from production to end results, right? What do these different industries need from their ERP? Is there something they should focus on first and foremost?
Yeah, I think it's, I think the misnomer that we run across all the time, I have Erica, our salesperson, also my wife, her voice right here in my ear saying, okay, I'll do the laundry. I'm sorry, I forgot it. No, I always do the laundry. We have like a laundry fairy at our house.
Oh,
It's actually me.
I need one of those.
No, well, you can find one someplace else because somehow we magically get the laundry done.
That's right.
But other things she says to me about this specific industry is the concept of right-sizing software for these different folks at the appropriate stage. Grow, it's a grow into approach. Because it's interesting because a lot of natural resources organizations that we work with, like all of them, now that I think about it, across all of those areas, including wind, these are people that are extremely experienced. So these people have been at larger wind companies, they've been at larger solar companies, and they get the entrepreneur itch. There's a ton of money that's available right now, right? So they'll probably be able to get capital, especially if you have industry veterans that have kind of proven they could be successful at a big company, and they're like, you know what, I'm going to go do this on my own. So they get funding. And then they're like, okay, let's go, right? And they start doing the hard stuff, which is their business. And then we need software. So sometimes they'll just go out and get QuickBooks Online, which frankly is good enough for quite a while because again, it's a big checkbook.
Right.
But other times we'll have folks that come to us and say, oh, we're doing a startup and we're looking at this and we're going to go with, I keep picking on SAP, but we're going to go to an instance of SAP. Because that's what we had for 20 years at, whoever. GE has some field services organizations, oil field services that they've rolled up. So that's where we were, and now we're going to go do our own firm. Especially 10 years ago, this was more the case, a little bit less now. But the point of it is that you have these veterans that have come off these larger platforms that were working at $1 billion, $10 billion, $50 billion companies like Exxon. And so they say, okay, we're thinking we should get SAP. What should we do? We're like, no, don't do that, right? But I will say this, and this is the truth, is that SAP is really working on their licensing pricing. So, and it's very, very, it's much more affordable than it's been to stand up an instance. The implementation's still pretty big. But if you have an organization that's really well funded and they're saying, look, our timeline on this business is the life cycle of this business is 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are major energy plays where they can pull together a lot of capital, $500 million, and pump it into the ground, go buy all the corn you can find, put up the windmills, whatever it is. And it's a lot of capital to get started.
Right, up front.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that process is extremely valuable of just getting the process set up, getting the business, getting the equipment and everything is in place, and then they sell. So if that's going to happen, you know that the buyer they don't care what software you run. Right. They don't care. Right. So don't put yourself through a huge tier 1 implementation if the timeline for the business is
ultimately it's going to be sold.
Ultimately it's going to be sold, right? And so, could you get into a medium size? We did this for another mine where we got them into an application that there wasn't a lot of industry experience on it, but it was a rapid implementation, and we kind of knew. Robert Anderson on our team uses a specific kind of phrase about a show, which I can't use on this call.
Right.
But it's a type of show that's not a pretty show to watch where there's a lot of mess. Dookie show? I can't remember what he says. Anyway, but we knew it was going to be an extremely complex implementation, mostly because where the mine was located, the people that were driving the requirements were just not very sophisticated. So we knew that they were going to take forever to make decisions, forever to change their mind, forever to test. And when you're in a bigger ERP that requires, 3 people full-time on the project, guess what? They're going to bill no matter what on the implementation. They just are.
Right.
They're allocated to the project. That's what they do. They just do it. Versus the smaller ERPs where you can get partners that are a little more fluid, cloud-based. I'm not talking the angels in the sky. I'm talking about, they're in wherever part of the world doing your implementation, but they're not on you full-time.
Right.
So the smaller apps you can bring the price down, and you can get the implementation done. Maybe you don't have this much functionality, but I will never forget in a natural resources firm we were with, the COO was like, oh, well, if I have that much functionality, I have to hire a whole bunch of people
to run it.
So if your time frame is short, right, the life cycle is short, and the functionality is pretty straightforward, and it's going to take a lot to build out one of these big things anyway. Maybe some big one, you don't necessarily need to do it. But again, there are plays, like we've got clients where, we're 50 million today and we're going to be 500 in 3 years, and then we're going to be $1 billion in 5. I'm like, no, you're not. Then you look behind the covers, you're like, oh my God, you really could be here. Then it does make sense to go big. So just look, and we talk about this all the time, right? It's not just feature function requirements and what we used in the past, right? It's also what are we looking at in the future in terms of trajectory, and get the system that best supports that.
Right. So me not knowing anything about any of these industries or any of the software platforms, is there one that performs better for one specific industry?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's putting you on the spot, but is oil and gas, is there one that might perform better for them than for mining, for solar?
That's a great question. And I guess what we've seen, SAP. That's immediately for all those industries.
For all
SAP,
of them.
all of them. But again, it's sort of I can't think of a really good analogy, honestly. SAP is the biggest enterprise software company in the world, and the software is good. You can make it do anything
you need it to do.
Right, that you need it to do. But you got to have the technical people that understand it to be able to make it do it. Now, SAP out of the box has industry packs that are very strong. So they've built functionality for these different industries for sure.
Yeah.
But it is an expensive solution to implement. So you better damn well know what you're getting into, right? It used to be maybe like an old Jaguar. I think I actually just bought one, an SUV, and kind of came across it and I was like, wow, this thing's amazing. It's amazing. I love that car. It's so fast. But I'm looking at this thing like, Jaguars are terrible. It's going to be expensive to maintain, right? But I'm like, well, I don't use it this much. And I got rid of my other cars, so I take our little Honda around, but that thing sits someplace else. But, it used to be known for a lot of maintenance, but then Ford bought Jaguar and Range Rover, and I think it's gotten better, and they've gotten some better processes. So it sort of gets known as like, oh, God, it's going to be a lot. SAP is like that.
Like now, learn from their mistakes,
right? Learn from the mistakes, but can you get a good partner who really understands the industry? There's some great, Alumni comes to mind for mining companies on SAP platform. There's multiple types of SAPs. I can hear the guys at Alumni saying, hey, there's not just SAP S/4HANA, right? There's also Business One. There's also by design. But that solution has good industry packs. You get a good partner who can come in with a pretty effective solution, and it makes a ton of sense, right? Then other companies would look at that investment and just say like, no way, because here's the other piece, right? Is every dollar that goes into software is one less dollar into operations, right? It's even worse than nonprofits, right? Nonprofits are always like, oh, I don't know if we should put the money into the software or we should put it into the mission. The natural resources folks are like a million times worse, right? They're like, okay, if we put $1 over here, the opportunity cost and the timeline for which I need to start producing to pay these people that I borrowed all their money, I can't afford to put that time frame off. Right. Totally different missions and all that stuff, fine. But the bottom line is these decisions are just as much about capital and the deployment of capital to the right level, right? Because when you go to a bigger ERP, you get this much capability. Maybe we really needed this much. Good, let's get a partner that has the software that does this much, but let's just deploy that much, right? Or let's get a solution that does that much, knowing we may need to grow into it in the future. Or knowing we got a 5-year, 7-year window, and guess what? Whoever's going to buy us is going to say, hey, that software you have, get rid of it, right? Oh, yeah.
They would.
Oh, yeah. Some of them do. A strategic play will definitely do that, right? That's part of why they buy.
And they take that money out of the bottom line?
There you go.
Would they?
They could. They could, yeah. So there's so many considerations. Again, I love these calls. I hope they're helpful to people in these industries, because don't just think because you've used the software in the past at the big company, it makes sense to do now. And I think that's obvious. But also really think about those dimensions of, where are we at today? Where are we going in the future? What are our real requirements? What's the most likely scenario on the strategy basis? If we're hiring a lot of people that are, newer to their careers, get something simple, all the stuff we normally talk about. But, in these particular industries, there are some great solutions, and there's people that really understand those industries and can speak the nomenclature.
Right.
But their products, unfortunately, some of these organizations are not investing in the technology platform, and that's dangerous, right? Because those organizations, they could get hit with a cyber attack, right? They might not be able to scale. Remote mobility might be an issue. Ask those technology questions too.
That is a great piece of advice. So, okay, I think we're coming to the end of our time, but if there's one piece of advice that you could leave our listeners with today, what would it be?
I have to take a sip of water to answer this one.
I mean, if someone is needing an ERP system and they don't know where to begin, I mean, beyond QuickBooks that you mentioned, what's the one thing that they should consider first and foremost?
Hiring somebody who's done this before. And I'm not even talking about us. We'll help, no problem. We can, in a free call, get them going in the right direction.
Right.
But I do think the one thing I would say is, of all of our industries, having somebody who has, that ERP implementation experience with mining or with upstream or downstream or solar or wind, biofuels, having that experience is just, it's almost like, I don't know if I'd do a major project without it. So it's not just go out and get QuickBooks so you can use the fancy checkbook, right? Because you're spending a ton of money, right? And maybe, you can do a little bit of asset management, just tracking assets, inventory and stuff like that in QuickBooks, fine. But when you're ready to make that leap, it's just as important, if not more, to have a person that might be more of a mid-level kind of person. They don't need to be way up here in the stratosphere of salary, but somebody who's been through these kinds of transformations before in your industry and is somewhat familiar, not just with the software, but with the process of evolving a business on a software platform is really, really invaluable. That person will save you millions of dollars.
That's right. And with all the requirements and expectations in the industries, right?
You got it.
So, well, Shawn, thank you as always for sharing.
Now natural resources for ERP.
Yes. Well, thank you for always sharing your experience with us. We
glad to do it.
So, thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. Please let us know if you have any questions. We're happy to help in any way we can. Be sure to join us for our next webinar scheduled for Thursday, June 2nd, when we will be offering a free CPE event, a definitive guide to cloud ERP deployment. We will cover what cloud ERP is and discuss the benefits and pitfalls of the various cloud deployments available in the current market. Please go to our website, erpadvisorsgroup.com, for more details and to register. ERP Advisors Group is one of the country's top independent enterprise software advisory firms. ERP Advisors Group advises mid to large-sized businesses on selecting and implementing business applications from enterprise resource planning, customer relationship management, human capital management, business intelligence, and other enterprise applications, which equates to millions of dollars in software deals each year across many industries. This has been the ERP Advisor. Thank you again for joining us.
ERP Advisors Group is one of the country's top independent enterprise software consulting firms, advising mid to large-sized businesses on selecting and implementing business applications, including ERP, CRM, HCM, business intelligence, and other enterprise applications, which equate to millions of dollars in software deals each year across many industries. This has been the ERP Advisor.